It is now my pleasure to welcome our Reverend Paul Johnson, who's going to be speaking to us about Rosa Parks. Reverend Johnson, thank you for joining us today.
Yes. Well, good morning, everyone. Nice to be with you via Zoom. In a 1988 essay, best-selling author and Unitarian Universalist minister Robert Fulgham discusses how Rosa Parks refused to move from her seat when commanded to do so by a bus driver, and notes this, and quotes, "Rosa Parks, not an activist or radical, just a quiet, conservative, church-going woman with a nice family and a decent job as seamstress. Her feet were tired." Well, Rosa Parks always resented that feet were tired business. She said, I wasn't tired. I was a vigorous 42-year-old woman. I was tired of humiliation. But also, Fulgham, who got so many things right in his writings that I've enjoyed them so much, gets it wrong in his statement that she was not an activist or a radical. There were few more activist or radical people than Rosa Parks. And I want to share with you her very interesting, wonderful story this morning. But to tell that story, we have to go back to her childhood. She was raised a good deal of the time by her maternal grandparents. Her mother was often off teaching at a distance. Her father was out of town in construction work. And so her grandparents were her role models in many ways. Her grandfather, Sylvester, had been a slave, and he had been terribly treated by his masters. He had been beaten regularly. The overseer refused to feed him properly, and he had to beg for scraps of food. He wasn't even given shoes to wear. And so he hated his white overlords with a passion. And he was very fiery about it. He was very light-skinned and could pass for white often. And Rosa tells this interesting story that he would often embarrass white people. He'd go up to a group of them, to a white person and a company of others, white persons, where there was someone that didn't know him. And we'd go to that person and would say, "Hello, my name is Edwards," and shake hands. Well, that was unheard of for a black man to refer to himself by his last name, or that he would shake a white person's hand. Of course, everyone who knew him was embarrassed. And then when the person whom he had greeted found out he was black, they were embarrassed as well. But he did this many, many times, according to Rosa. And she wondered how he had lived to such an old age. But he did. And he said to her time after time, "Do not let anyone ever take advantage of you or threaten you with violence, ever, because then you will be beholden to that person. You will fear that person." So as a child, she never did. And she tells a number of stories in her autobiography about this issue. One time, a young white boy with his fist raised said to her, "I'm going to beat you up." And she picked up a brick and said, "Just try it." She went home and told her grandmother, who was not a firebrand as much of a firebrand as her husband. And she said to Rosa, "You're going to be lynched by the time you're 20. You just can't do that." One day, she was going to school in Montgomery, and a white boy came up to her on roller skates and tried to push her off the sidewalk. It was de rigueur that a white person could never, or black person could never impede the progress of a white person on a sidewalk. But she did not get out of the way for him. She pushed him down. Now, that boy's mother saw that happen. And she said to Rosa, "I could put you in jail forever for doing that to her son." Well, she went home and told her mother what had happened, and her mother immediately put her in a different school. When one time she was in the woods gathering firewood with her brother Sylvester, and some white boys came along and said that, "Let's throw them into the river." And she said, if one of us goes in, all of us goes in. You're not going to just throw us in. We're going to hold on to you and you're going to get what as well. Well, those white boys thought better of that and backed off. But she was raised with that credo: never let anyone take advantage of you. Never let anyone threaten violence against you and let it pass. After World War I, when she was living with her grandparents, the Ku Klux Klan began a good deal of activity in her area. They would ride through the area. They would go into homes and threaten people. And her grandfather, during these times, would sit by the fire in his rocking chair for the whole night with a double-barreled shotgun. And he said to Rosa, if they come in this house, I know I will at least kill one of them. She wrote, quote, I sat there with him because I wanted to see him shoot. Well, it never happened that they experienced an incursion by the Ku Klux Klan, but they were ready. Her grandfather was fortunate. He had 18 acres of land, and they made a pretty good living off that land and some other employment. But he said to his daughters, all three of them, I never want you to have to cook or clean for white people. That was his raison d'etre, to be able to get them an education so they would not have to. But one of his daughters died at the age of 17, and another gave in and was a cook and cleaning lady. But Rosa's mother got a teaching certificate so she could be the real pride of her father. So there was a real conflict in her mind between the firebrand grandfather and the more level-headed grandmother as to how to get along in the world. And these two factors were always a part of her. But she claimed that she would never give in. And when it came time for her to choose a husband, she chose a man who was the third person she had ever met in her life who was unafraid of white people. The first, of course, was her grandfather, Sylvester, and the other was a man named Gus Vaughn, and we went who worked on a plantation. And when the owner would come along, he would often say to Gus, I don't like you. And Gus would say right back, there's no love lost, and walk on. He feared no man. She wasn't attracted to Raymond Parks at first because he was light-skinned, but the fact that he was not fearful and that he was a member of the local NAACP overcame the skin color factor. They were married and stayed married for 55 years until her husband's death. But talk about being radical. Her husband was active in a group that sought to support the Scottsdale Boys. Remember their story? They were unjustly accused of rape and sentenced to death. And it took concerted action again and again over the years to save them from the electric chair and ultimately to get them paroled. The last one of the Scottsdale Boys wasn't paroled until 1950. But during that time of turmoil, the police shot and killed two of the persons who were working on the case to support the boys. But one night, her husband had the meeting of those who were working on the case at their house. And there were so many guns on the table that she didn't have any room to put the refreshments to serve them. But she joined the NAACP, and because she was the only woman in the group, she was asked to be the secretary, and she served as secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery for many, many years. And that involved not only taking minutes at the meetings, but serving as an assistant to the president of the NAACP, E.D. Nixon. He was a porter on the railroad and very active as president over the years. So she, every day she finished her work as a seamstress in a downtown department store, and then would go to the NAACP office and assist E.D. Nixon in the work of the NAACP. They had many simple cases of people not being afforded rights by landlords, but there were also many more serious cases where they got legal help for people accused of serious crimes, such as beatings and rapes and murders. And one of their successful cases had to do with two Black kids, ages 15 and 16, who had come down from New Jersey to visit relatives, and no one told them about the rules of the buses. They sat in the wrong seats, they were arrested, and a judge was about to put them in reform school until they were 21 years old for that one infraction. But the NAACP got involved and we were able to get that charge reduced to a fine. But they struggled so often with the buses. There's such injustice on the buses. The first 8 or 10 seats were set aside for white seats, and 8 or 10 seats in the back were Black seats. And the ones in between were no man's land. Blacks could sit in them, but if more whites came in, they could displace any Blacks in no man's space. Black persons and white persons could not be seated next to each other. And a Black person could not even be seated across the aisle from a white person. So what would happen when a white person came in, the Black folks would have to stand in the back of the bus. The other thing that was so hated was that the Blacks would have to pay their fare up in the front like everyone else, and then get off the bus and go to the back door of the bus and enter there. And one day in 1943, Rosa got on the bus in the front to pay her fare, but she could see that the Blacks were so clogged up at the back entry way that she wouldn't be able to get on through the back door, through the back door. So she started to walk down the center aisle, and James Black, the same driver who gave her grief in 1955, was driving that day, and he said, "You can't do that on my bus," and he threw her off the bus. Well, so many times the bus drivers were very mean to Black folks. For instance, they would pay their fare, but before they could get to the back bus door, they would take off and leave without them. So the NAACP was always striving for more courtesy by the drivers. She also was involved in voter registration, which was a very dangerous thing in Montgomery. Quote, at one point, she wrote, quote, "I held the records for all of the Black voters in Montgomery, all 31 of them. And some of them were in the cemetery." Can you imagine that in that large city, only 31, with some of them having passed on? And there were so few because the registrars would never announce what the day of registration would be. All of a sudden, they would just announce it, like from 10 a.m. to 12 noon on some weekday when most people were at work. And so you had to be there at the particular time. And sometimes the NAACP was able to get a good number of African Americans there, but right at 12, the line would close and people would be sent away. The other thing, of course, is that they had to pass a literacy test or own property in order to vote. And it was not written into the law, but it had become practice that a custom that you had to bring a white person along with you to vouch for you. Well, Rosa said she would never bring a white person to vote for her, but she determined that she was going to qualify to vote. So she kept track very closely when an announcement was made as to when the registration would be open. The first time she took the 21 question test, she was sure she passed, but she didn't hear for the longest time. And finally she went in and she was told that she hadn't answered correctly the requisite number of questions. So they wouldn't register. She tried a second time and didn't pass and was told the same thing. Well, the third time, she kept track on a piece of paper of all her answers. So when she handed in the paper, she said, "I've got all my answers on this piece of paper." And she said if they did not allow her to vote, she would make a legal issue of it. And that third time, they gave her the right to vote. And she was involved in that very dangerous effort of registering Black voters for many years. She also was involved with the youth division of the NAACP, trying always to urge youth to assert their rights and then to push the boundaries when that was necessary. When the Freedom Train came to South with copies of the actual Declaration of Independence and Constitution on display, it was a federal event, so blacks and whites had to be allowed to go through the exhibit together. And that made some whites very, very unhappy and very angry, and saying hateful things to the black kids. But they encouraged the kids to go ahead and assert their rights. Another very discriminatory thing was that the whites or the blacks were not allowed to take out books from the main public library. All the books that they wanted had to be sent out to one of the black branch libraries far away. Time after time, they would try to break this policy by having the young people go into the library to try to take out books. And time again, they would be sent away bookless. But and they also planned to make a test case to challenge the discrimination on the buses. And they had one woman who was 15 years old. She was the granddaughter of the Gus that I mentioned earlier, who was arrested because she refused to move. And they wanted to make a case of this, but they found out that she was pregnant and unmarried, and they didn't want to take a chance with that. But when Rosa was arrested, who had a sterling reputation, they took her case as a test case which began to wind its way through the courts. So Rosa took part in the boycott of the buses by the black community. Martin Luther King, of course, was president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, was in charge, but she was right there in the background with the committee as one of the prime persons responsible for finding rides for 30,000 people a day who wouldn't take the bus. Isn't that amazing? The white establishment tried in many ways, of course, to break the boycott. They found a law which they claimed disallowed such boycotts, and it was added to the court docket and that began to wend its way through the courts as well. The white community saw to it that the insurance for the churches that had vans or station wagons was canceled, until finally Martin Luther King found an insurance agent in Atlanta that got Lloyd's of London to insure all of the vehicles. And then we know finally the federal Supreme Court decision came down on December 20th, 1956, 381 days after the boycott was started, which outlawed that type of discrimination on the buses. So, Rosa wasn't always in the front lines, but she was there providing the quiet support and logistics for that great effort, which launched the civil rights movement. She also, in the summer of 1955, went to the Highlander Institute in Mount Eagle, Tennessee, an institution that was dedicated to the total desegregation of the South. It was unjustly claimed by some detractors that this was a communist front, but it empowered people to work for their rights. So Rosa Parks was not, as many claim, a cleaning lady whose feet were tired and just didn't want to move. She was an activist for many years, but she did it in a quiet way. She set her marker down and said, "I will not be moved." After the Montgomery boycott was over, her job was gone. Her husband's job was gone. They went for a time to Detroit, and then they took a job administering the guest house at Hampton Institute in Virginia. But then after a few years, she was given a job at Congressman John Conyers' office in Detroit. from 1965 until her retirement in 1988. In 1987, she began the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development for Young People, which was active in a very helpful way for young people for many, many years. And every year until her death in 2005, she made 25 to 30 appearances speaking on behalf of civil rights across the country. And she received many, many honors from government and educational institutions. Well, what can we derive from her life during this Black History Month in terms of insight and understanding? You know, I think it's important to stress again and again that she was not a lone ranger, but that she was an institutionalist working through such organizations as the NAACP and the Montgomery Improvement Association. I'm so pleased that so many UU congregations, and hopefully this congregation can take part with other organizations to magnify and amplify our voice. The week before last, I attended the ministers' training session for the DART organization, which is an organization which binds together congregations for community social justice action. And there is such an organization in the West Melbourne area. And I'm going to be in contact with them to see possible ways that we can work with other congregations for social justice. So together, we can amplify our values. You know, we have to credit her religious faith as well. She was a lifelong member of the African American Episcopal Church, and she wrote in her memoirs in 1994 entitled Quiet Strength these words: "I learned from the Bible that people should stand up for their rights, just as the people of Israel stood up to Pharaoh. When I reflect on conditions in the South, I recall that people had become worn out from being humiliated. They were sick of accepting racial segregation that seemed to be worsening each day. Someone had to take the first step. And at that moment on the bus, I decided to resist and take the consequences. It was worth it. I'm glad to know that this and many other incidents have brought a change," end quote. She read the Bible every day, particularly the Psalms. I noted in reading her autobiography that she stopped for a while reading the Bible every day after she was married. But her mother asked her, "Are you still reading the Bible?" And so she had to get back on track. She would be in the good places. I want to close today by a vignette that happened in 1990 that I find very heartwarming. It was that year that Nelson Mandela was released from prison after so many years of imprisonment. And 4 months after his release, he came to the US with the primary goal of encouraging the US to keep its sanctions on against South Africa, of course, which was still under apartheid. And so he had a ticker tape parade in New York in his honor, and he spoke to a joint session of Congress. But then he went to Detroit. And Jesse Jackson, who was in Detroit when Mandela was about to come, was asked by a reporter, "Well, why is Nelson Mandela coming to Detroit?" And Jesse Jackson said, "Well, it was the home of Joe Louis. He wanted to see that. And he wants to meet Rosa Parks." Well, he did, of course, while he was there, speak to a sold out, I guess it probably wasn't sold out, but to a crowd of 49,000 people at the baseball stadium there in Detroit, the Tiger Stadium. But as he was, he landed, of course, in Detroit, and as he was coming down the ramp from the plane, he saw the group that was there to visit him and welcome him. And at the head of that line was Rosa Parks. And when he saw her, suddenly he froze and he stared open mouthed. with tears in his eyes. And he walked up to Rosa, and a low, melodious voice, he began to chant, Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks. And of course, the whole crowd began to yell, Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks. And then the two brave old souls, their lives so distant, yet their dreams so close, fell into each other's arms, rocking back and forth in a long, joyful embrace. So today, on this day, Sunday in Black History Month, I say Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.